Where I wanted to just generally kick off and what's been on my mind is I was just toying with this idea earlier. Uh, in the interest of starting with the biggest picture and the most macro level possible, we often talk about like the state of the union. Is there such thing as a state of the world, of the collective? Is there such thing as a unifying perspective or reality? And where is that reality at in terms of its evolution? Where is the human story today? How do we find ourselves? Because I don't know, first of all, I'd be curious your take on this. Is there a collective version of where we are as a species? It's very hard to integrate all those different reality tunnels from country to country, culture to culture, language to language, because they all seem to be their own reality. And if so, where is it at? Because there seems to be a lot of disarray in this country, in America right now. And there's two opposing realities that are in extreme conflict with one another to the point where reality itself, I don't even know what to make of it anymore.
Reality war. That's a great question. You have the innocence to ask the hardest questions.
I have you here. That's why.
Most people wouldn't even get that question out, even if they thought of it, because it's so big and so abstract. And then also most people on my side of the table wouldn't even try to answer it because it's just it's a field of landmines, right? There's like no good way of answering this question. I'll start by introducing a framework. Let's just say there's a spectrum of ways of looking at the world from the romantic to the realist. So I'll sketch these archetypes. The realist believes that any emotions or even thoughts or narratives they have about the world are purely interior. They're like chemicals in your head. There's a certain embrace of Darwinian nihilism. You are a speck of dust on a speck of dust floating in infinite space and time. You evolved from like single cell organisms to monkeys to humans, and your parents had sex and here you are. It's a very and when you're gonna die someday, and then your feelings about and thoughts about American politics in the year 2020, 2021 are entirely subjective. The fact that other people agree or disagree with you is sort of moot, and there's a kind of structural determinism in all of this. Things are going to play out in an almost computational fashion. If you had the mind of an AI and you could abstract out enough, you would just sort of see that there are all these large impersonal forces, class forces, technological forces, memes that are just playing out like viruses over time, and you are kind of a particle in that story. You're like a blip in that story. And so the realist actually sort of there's an emotional deflation that comes from that, because you realize the meaninglessness of everything. But then there's also an emotional release, because if meaning is ultimately arbitrary, then just tell yourself whatever narrative is adaptive to you and whatever narrative works for you. So if you're experiencing some kind of intellectual pain or emotional pain, just drop it and replace it with a better story.
Sure.
And there's less of a question about what's true. The romantic has a very different way of looking at the world. The romantic, if the romantic runs into someone on the street, the romantic will interpret it as a sign. I was meant to run into you. There's synchronicity. There's serendipity. There's some aspect of destiny or fate. If the romantic has a thought or an emotion, He'll wonder whether it's Jiminy Cricket in his head or the muse, or like they're being led by a spirit or guided to do something. And the romantic has this compass that he or she is using to make decisions, and they're using their gut to make these decisions, and they're very oriented towards this idea that like truth is objective and exists in the world and exists between people and isn't just in my head. It's not just a purely Cartesian thing that is in my head. So with that framework, let me go to answer your question. There are things I could say, I'm not even sure I could justify, but that are feelings I have about the world. I could try post hoc to rationalize them. I could even try to put them in realist terms. I could try to substantiate my like intuitions with macroeconomic or technological like evidence or political evidence or whatever, or philosophical references. But really, they're just like, you know, my own random opinions. Okay, I'd say that we're in a very post-political place. The transition of power from the Republicans to the Democrats, from mostly just dethroning Trump, was a kind of cathartic moment in the zeitgeist, and it's almost like, you know, Biden sort of like a puppet administration. There's this sense where like we can all just go on and go back to normal, and so he's sort of like the new Warren G. Harding, like return to normalcy, and with, you know, that combined with the vaccines and the reopenings, and, you know, people like if 2020 was a fear stampede, feels like 2021 is like a greed stampede. Like Dionysus is afoot, and there are these incredible Dionysian energies being released in the world right now. In New York City, where I'm at, it's like endless parties. It's 1929. It's like social euphoria, and everyone wants to like meet for, you know, breakfast, coffee, lunch, you know, dinner, drinks, and so it's just everyone's running around, running themselves ragged, having fun. Everyone who is single is dating like crazy, and there's this this Dionysian energy in the markets. The markets are well, at least, you know, I'll speak in terms of private markets. This is probably the best fundraising environment in my lifetime. It may, you know, I don't know if there will ever be one again in my lifetime that is like this, like bullish. I'll give you some anecdotes. Like I know someone whose company didn't exist 12 months ago, and he just closed his Series B, and you know, sold something like 10% of his company for $20 million. And it's just, what the heck, you know, this company doesn't even have revenue. There's nothing like revenue to F up a good story, right?
Wow.
So I hear about, and that's just one anecdote. I've been exposed to about half a dozen of these where it doesn't even make sense what's happening in the market. So I hear that, and there's a bit of like an alarm bell going off in my mind around like bull market, like, and the question I'm asking the smartest market analysts I know, some best researchers I know, is this 1918 or 1929? Is this 1980, 81 or 83, or is this 1999? Are we at the beginning of a bull cycle, or are we at the end of a bull cycle? And I'm generally surrounded by optimists who think this is like the beginning. And, you know, they have some good reasons. There's, you know, the Spanish flu ended, World War I ended, and there was this like 10-year period where there was this bull run, and it didn't just suddenly end up being 1929. There was just like, there was a whole decade of incredible productivity growth, driven by like three big technology platforms. And I'm spend a lot of time with Kathy Wood and Brett Winton and the team at ARK Invest. And they've got a great grand narrative, and their grand narrative is like, look, in the beginning of the 20th century, there was electricity, the internal combustion engine, and I forget what the third technology was. Maybe it was like television. I don't know. There was no, maybe the telephone. And those three technologies, were platforms that many companies were built on. And today we've got five. And so techno-capitalism is this incredible deflationary force that makes everything better, faster, and cheaper. And also makes new things that are things you didn't even know you wanted. And so there's this bull sort of techno-utopian narrative where, in the next 10, there's a lot of good reasons to be excited. And there's a lot of good reasons why markets are frothy, because in the next 10 or 20 years, hundreds of millions of more people are going to exit poverty and enter the middle class. Standards of living are going to go up. And we're going to enter this period of like incredible abundance. And in our lifetime, miracles will happen. Like we're going to figure out how to cure diseases with DNA editing, et cetera, et cetera. So without, repeating their whole narrative, I think I would just point your listeners to go listen to ARK. They're great. If ever, I'm in a funk about the world, I want to tune in to optimism. I go listen to Kathy and Brett, and they're not, sometimes it's easy to be a pessimist about the world because you can sort of easy to see all the problems with things, or easy to think about all the reasons why things won't work. And it's actually intellectually difficult to be an optimist because you have to think about why they might anyways. And you have to overcome all these arguments. So, and Kathy and her team are no joke. I think the best researchers I've come across. She ran thematic investing at AllianceBernstein for decades. And she, like, her macroeconomic coverage is very sophisticated, and her team are like deep diving into every major technology in the world. They're very closely studying like research papers and the latest cutting edge science. So they're coming from an informed place, and they're very bullish. But my counterpoint to this has been Peter Thiel wrote an essay in 2009, and it was, the title of the essay is I think, The Education of a Libertarian. It's a very short essay. You could read it. It's like one or two pages. Read it online, and he basically frames technology and politics as being in a race. And let me explain. Let me put my own paraphrase on what he meant and why it relates, why it's like sort of the right framework for thinking about what's going on in the world. Politics is sort of an inflationary force. There's this great Benjamin Franklin quote. Let me find it because I want to get the exact. There we go. When the people find that they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic. And so I think a lot of people don't really realize why, like, we're in such an incredible, bull market. And there's the Milton Friedman quote: "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." We expanded the money supply by something like 1/3 last year, and the amount of printing, the amount of borrowing that the government did is just enormous. And the effect on government debt to GDP ratios is alarming. But it's all very stimulatory. And so whether it's fiscal or monetary policy, the incentives in our democratic political system are always to vote for more. Like, you have some some program that is going to like, give me this benefit, like, give me a new school, give me a new road, give me a new, even less productive things like, you can all come up with almost any notional benefit. There's really no accountability about whether these programs end up working. But
Yeah,
the tendency is to just spend more money. And the Keynesian argument in favor of this is that even if it's not particularly efficient spending, even if you're paying people to dig ditches and fill them back up, like Napoleon did, you're still somehow putting money into the economy and you're still creating jobs. The problem with it is that inflation, and these credit cycles, gravity might go on vacation, but gravity can't go on vacation forever. And so the line that comes to mind is that civilizations are born stoic and die Epicurean. And so I'm neither bullish nor bearish. I'm hawkish. I don't want to be one of those people with like a short on the market when the market might have six months of an insane bull run, or a year, or 2 years, or 3 years, or 6 years, or 10 years. I can't time it, and I certainly don't want to like get slaughtered with literally a bull charging at me. Like I don't want to get in the way of the bull. And I think markets are certainly not rational on short time periods. And even a decade is, in the scheme of history, a short time period. So I think there's actually something incredibly productive about irrational exuberance. Like, it's maybe 10 companies that receive ridiculous terms on their fundraising, their equity rounds. Maybe 9 of them fail, but one of them is the next Amazon. So it is sort of net, it can be productive over a long time period. But I definitely, this is where, when I've given you a little bit of a economic, political, and technological analysis of the world today. But now I'm going to move to more like a social, philosophical, spiritual analysis, which is, I think, kind of what the innocence and also the profundity of your question is like around that. It's like when you sort of abstract away the sort of, techno-political analysis, techno-economic political analysis, you move up a level. Like, what do you find there? And I think, so I think part of the reason why we're in such a post-political phase is, when you have all this money flying around and sort of certainly keeping up with the Joneses element. So-and-so just raised a huge round. I need to go raise a huge, so-and-so's just exited and just bought a house. I should buy a house. So-and-so is going to the Hamptons. I should go to the Hamptons. So-and-so is going to Mykonos. I should go to Mykonos. So there's this return of FOMO. I just befriended the guy who coined the term FOMO, and we were talking about this. It's just like, there wasn't a lot of FOMO last year when everyone was stuck at home and nobody was having fun. There's a lot of FOMO now, and so much economic activity is driven by mimetic desire. And so there's a bit of like a musical chairs element going, of like, the music hasn't stopped yet, so let's keep running around. But the Dionysian thing is, so again, civilizations are born Stoic and die Epicurean, or civilizations are born Apollonian and die Dionysian. The Dionysian euphoria, the partying, the bull market, this sort of environment tends to be very immoral or even amoral, and it's it's like financially disciplined and sort of financially undisciplined and morally undisciplined is sort of the sense of it. It's sort of like you move farther and farther away from fundamentals, and more you're driven by sort of like narrative and hype. I generally am like sort of queasy when I am in Dionysian environments. Like the darkest Dionysian environment I can imagine is my friend was telling me that he watched a documentary about the orgies that occurred in Hitler's bunker at the end of World War II. I was
Boy.
It's like, oh shit. Like, I don't even want to think about that. It's the darkest thought to even just imagine what that environment was like, where it's like, we basically destroyed the world and we know we're all going to die, and like justice is coming for us. But like, you know what, like, let's have some more drugs and let's have sex and let's party. And like that. I don't think that's what's going on in New York right now. I think there's like a healthier element to what's going on, which is like we've all been cooped up, you know. Let's enjoy life. But there is a bit of an unhealthy element to it, which is like we are kind of ostriching, where it's like there are these, like, you know, to your point, like these reality wars going on. You know, Democrats and Republicans, red states and blue states are in completely different worlds. And so there's there's broader question in our society of like, what is truth? There's like deep skepticism around a lot of our institutions and their credibility. But the two things we seem to be able to agree on as a society are that like money, sex, and power are desirable, or something like that, right? And because we can agree on those things, we can't agree on, like, you know, the existence of God. We can't agree on, you know, the 10 Commandments. We can't agree on other things. We can't agree on religion. We can't agree on politics. You know, our political differences, though, are increasingly around who gets the money and who gets the power and who gets the sex. But like, we can't agree that, like, you know, sort of happiness seems to be sort of, and when I say happiness, I mean hedonic, you know, sort of happiness does seem to be the value that is not moving, kind of like the Archimedean point for our society. And as a virtue, I'm not sure that's the stuff on which civilizations are built. So I look at this whole thing and I feel like, okay, gravity's taken a vacation. Markets are blowing up. You know, true love has gone out the window, and we just hook up on Hinge. And we all want sex, money, and power. Like, when will gravity return from vacation? When will we, like, discover that there's more, that fundamental, you know, performance and profits matter, and you know, structure matters, discipline matters, efficiency matters, prices matter, and not, you know, not all relationships are created. When will these things come back? And it would have to be some sort of like another crisis event. I don't know how far out that crisis event is, and I don't know what the crisis will be. It could be another black swan event, like, you know, coronavirus and the lockdowns, et cetera. It could be as simple as a debt crisis, where, you know, the government ends up being in a stagflationary place, like it was in the 1970s, where you had an economic recession and inflation at the same time. But I think it would be even worse now, because instead of having Andrew Mellon in the Treasury like we did in the 20s, or Paul Volcker like we did in the 80s at the Fed, who raised interest rates to like 20% in order to kill inflation. If we did that today, we would bankrupt the government, not just the economy, because the government spends something like 10% of its budget on paying interest alone. And so if that went to like 100% of its budget, you know, I mean, I don't know, would our society collapse? Or, you know, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm just being and then I sort of look at myself in the mirror, and this is why I frame the whole thing as like romantic or realist. I get to this point where I'm like, I built such a zoomed out like narrative that like I return to humility, and I'm like, I have no fucking clue. Like the world, the world is I don't have any agency over such a grand narrative. I'm just like a person. And I'm not sure my grand narrative is going to change my behavior, because you can't, like, again, you don't want to be shorting a bull market. Like, you don't want to be going through 1929 in New York and not be going to parties. Like, so not actually sure the utility of the grand narrative, or whether, even if I knew that my grand narrative was 100% correct, and I am not sure I'd be able to like change the world or change my own outcome necessarily. Like, in order to profit from a grand narrative, you not only need to like get the narrative right, you need to like know exactly how to trade it. Like, basically what's the arbitrage? Like, what is the like thing you can do to benefit from your unique insight into the world? And I'm very unclear on that.
I want to make sure I understand this, because it's very fascinating. And by the way, just incredible analysis overall. If
so it was a long answer. Sorry.
No,
it's winding.
It's perfect. It's this full analysis of the most critical components of our reality as we know them, at least. And I think each of those facets are very important to understand in order to go into that more, okay, we're going to kind of evolve into this more philosophical, spiritual level of the conversation. And that's kind of where we are dancing now. And you're saying that your grand narrative, or a grand narrative in general, may not necessarily change behavior. And yet a romantic or a realist, and definitely in terms of the examples that you shared of a realist, they are living a often meaningless existence, or at least that is their perspective.
Yeah.
And that, from as far as I can tell, can really impact a person's behavior, thought process, personal philosophy, and how their life in a very tangible way ends up playing out in terms of their individual success, disposition toward happiness outside of genetic and emotional makeup, the amount of money they make, the amount of sex power that they accumulate, should all, I imagine, stem from this grand narrative. So I'm kind of battling with what you're saying, because if there isn't, I guess I want to understand more deeply where the grand narrative falls apart for a person, in that perhaps it's not worth landing in one particular position. And I know you don't mean that position that it lands is fixed, because obviously the narrative must continue evolving with the changes in environment and politics and society and whatever that may be. But some of it is very classical ideology, I imagine, and parts of it are fixed.
Yep.
So am I asking myself, are we asking ourselves the right question when we toy with this spectrum of the narrative between realism and romanticism? Is it worth it? Is it beneficial? Does it not change behavior and my life? And one more kind of interesting thing you brought up is like, well, when you are sort of a hardcore realist, ultimately where you land is like, well, I can just swap in my own narrative here, essentially, of what this all means. Like, and it's funny because I've had this discussion with friends where they ultimately land in this place where we're, nothing but a meat bucket, ghost in a meat basket spinning on a clay rock in the middle of a universe, speck of dust, and yada, yada, yada. And ultimately where it just lands is like, well, it all means nothing, right? And so I'll just create a meaning for myself that's inspiring, or not. And if they don't, they become kind of a terrible person. If they do, they're kind of nihilistic, but it's this I'm still going to choose to create a good narrative for myself and be a good person. All of that just seems very depressing to me. I don't want
Mm-hmm.
it. And so probably where I land is more on the side of a romantic in your
Mm-hmm.
spectrum, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still quite the battle. And I want to make sure it's worth it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. There's a lot there. So let's suppose you and I were living during the during the fall of Rome, but the fall of Rome occurred over many decades and centuries. So let's just say we were living in the 3rd century AD, the 4th century AD, the 5th century AD, the beginning of the 5th century AD. So now the fall of Rome is within our century, but it's still 70 years away, 80 years away. So like, so what? So what do we do? Like what? So like, are you going to be a Jeremiah running around and telling the city that it is doomed to be destroyed unless it repents of its sins? The irony of the prophet is that if the prophet succeeds at getting people to repent, then the prophet is never a prophet because the predicted doom never came. And so
That's really
um,
good.
and so yeah, the thing to do probably during the fall of Rome is probably just to be a tourist, probably just enjoy Rome. You get to be one of the last people on earth to enjoy this cosmopolitan, superpower, where there won't be such a diverse city. There won't be such a, incredible pinnacle of human achievement for, maybe 1,000 years. And so, I guess enjoy it. Or there's the plot of, I don't know if have you read Asimov's Foundation series?
No,
It's one of the classic
I'll include
works of science fiction, and in it there's this mathematician who figures out how to apply statistical analysis to history over huge timescales to the point where he can predict the future, and nobody believes him. And then nobody wants to believe him because basically he predicts the collapse of the galactic empire, and he basically realizes the collapse is not preventable. So he actually doesn't party, which is interesting. He becomes kind of like a moral hero. But then there's the question of like he's doing things that are gonna benefit people long after he's dead. But what he does is he creates like a secret society, and he comes up with what ends up being called in the book the Selden Plan, and his name is Selden, Harry Selden, and he basically comes up with a plan, and the whole goal of the plan is that the secret base on one of the planets in the galaxy is going to be this one shining light in an ocean of darkness during a dark age. And it will take hundreds of years, but eventually it will shorten what would have been a 10,000 year long dark age into just a 1,000 year long dark age. And so he saved the galaxy from net 9,000 years of dark ages by shrinking the dark age. But he's going to be long dead. And it's also uncertain whether it works or not. And that's kind of the whole plot of the series. And so I look at that story and I'm like, okay, like even if you had enough confidence in your model, your grand narrative, your mathematical history, as it is in this sci-fi series, that you knew that you're living during the fall of Rome, and you knew there was a dark age to come, or like you can anticipate the next crisis. And even if you could think of some sort of a grand plan to shift the trajectory of the future in a better direction, there are still big questions to be asked. Like, why do you care? You're going to be dead. How do you define better? How do you motivate other people? And then why is this a better way to spend your time than, I guess, a different version of the how do you care question? Like founders of companies take a lot more risk than employees of companies but they have equity, and the equity will probably be worth something in their lifetime, right? And then there's all these other ways that we reward entrepreneurs. We reward them not only financially, but we reward them with status. We reward them with forms of influence that are like power, la 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 la. But like, you know, I think this is why the best talent in our society has no real incentive to like go into politics. Politics is where people get slaughtered. It's a great way to get slaughtered. And so, you know, I think one of the big differences between Francis in July 2021 versus the last time I was on your podcast, which was July 2020, is I spent, you know, basically the 4 years of 2016 to 2020 being hyper transparent, hyper expressive. I put my whole brain on paper. I put it out there for the world to see. I wrote hundreds of essays. It was very all over social media, and I was highly polarizing. A lot of people thought I was wrong. Either my arguments were wrong, my thinking was wrong, or that like I was just on the wrong side of history and had the wrong values. Or they thought I was maybe right, but they thought I was crazy to put it all out there because I was painting a big target on myself. But I somehow felt, romantically led to do it because I thought I might have an impact. In retrospect, I don't know. Like I ultimately feel like I'm returning to esotericism, right? The line of Christ that don't throw pearls to swine. It sounds very snobbish, and it's I shouldn't have just said it on a recorded line, but like there is this recognition that the most important truths are almost impossible. They like evaporate in the sunlight. Like you can't bring them into a public forum, whether it's the front page of the New York Times, the front page of the Wall Street Journal, or a New York Times bestseller, like a book in the airport. Like it just, or even on a podcast. Like I can try to like bring esoteric truths to your audience, but to some extent, I'm bringing like certain things into the sunlight that will just evaporate. And so I like may actually fail as a messenger. I may like fail to like bring them through. So Thiel wrote another great essay. This is much longer, called The Straussian Moment. And I think it's like one of the most magnificent pieces of writing I've ever read. And he refers to the work of Leo Strauss, and Strauss's whole political philosophy was around esotericism. So, if you were a historian under Stalin's regime, you couldn't write what you think in your history book. So you can't reveal, even if you feel like you have the truth, some historical truth, you can't write it down. The first and last chapter of your book have to be about how great Stalin is and how Stalin is the end of history. He's the pinnacle. But you might be able to like secretly weave in certain things into the narrative that a very discerning reader would be able to pick up on those subtleties and be like, oh, like you seem to be saying X, but you're actually saying Y, in a way that couldn't get you thrown in the gulag. But you're still putting it out there. And this is your way of like sort of protecting philosophy from politics. So I'm going to return to the fall of Rome and like actually talk about some things that people actually did. As people started to realize the Roman Empire was becoming fragile and splintering, the aristocrats fled to their country homes. So the people living in New York City, fled to the Hamptons, fled to upstate, fled to Tennessee, fled to New Hampshire, fled to Texas, fled to Miami. Sound familiar? And what do? They fortified their country houses. They bought guns and beans, and they turned them into what became known as the latifundia, which were the prototypes of the medieval castles. And so the whole medieval model was built around many, many castles spread all over. So power became decentralized. But inside of these castles, there were like little bubbles of light, little candles in the wind that protected the DNA of Roman civilization and ultimately allowed for medieval Europe and medieval Christendom to emerge. Sort of civilization went into a deep slumber and went through an incredible transformation in the years 400 AD to about, say, 800 or 1000 AD, until sort of European civilization came forth in an aggressive manner. But ultimately, the world in which we live was shaped by the decision of those people to build those, like, the first castles. It all goes back to this. The best metaphor for it is actually a prophecy from the book of Daniel, where Daniel talks about the sequence of empires. And, he has a dream. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream where there's a head of gold, shoulders of silver, a chest of iron, chest of bronze, legs of iron, and feet mixed with iron and clay. And the interpretation is that somehow Rome were like, so the golden head was like maybe the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar himself, and then the silver was the Persians, and the bronze was the Greeks, and the under Alexander, and then the legs were the Romans. The Roman Empire was the legs of iron, and then the bottom, the feet, was iron and clay. And the interpretation has always been that medieval Christendom was this, like, fractured, decentralized iron mixed with clay, that somehow Rome gave way to something that ultimately became more powerful than Rome, but was decentralized. And so if you think about the world today, what are we seeing? DeFi, decentralized finance, crypto, everything's becoming decentralized. We're talking about, like, sort of the new like digital nation states. There was the thing, sort of doesn't seem to be going anywhere fast, but the thing about floating cities on the oceans. But we're moving from a hegemonic US controlled world to, like, a more decentralized world where power's all over the place. And so therefore, I think actually the medieval model is an interesting one. And the two buildings that mattered in medieval Europe that were sort of archetypal and mythical were the castle and the cathedral. So there were the monks who were like scribes there, and they were recording the DNA of civilization. They were maintaining the scrolls in Latin, this language that very few people ultimately ended up understanding. But they were preserving Aristotle. They were preserving Plato. They were preserving all the things that were in the libraries that nobody actually cared about. So that someday, hundreds of years from now, like, we'll have something to go on. But those castles and those cathedrals were protected by the castles, because if you didn't have the guns and the beans, like if you didn't have the ultimately the Machiavellian realist power, you couldn't protect the romantic dream of civilization. And so, sorry, I'm on a long rant, but I might as well go all the way through to the end.
Every second of
it. I think we are still in this civilizational epoch defined by Nietzsche's Death of God. So, Nietzsche can be viewed as a prophet who, at the end of the 19th century, said that basically we've come to a place where the Enlightenment has eroded or destroyed our confidence in ultimate objective meaning, and so which had been the sort of underlying foundation of Western civilization up until that point, and that this presaged a great war for money, sex, and power, and that this would result in like all sorts of like a bloodbath in the 20th century. And the 20th century was a bloodbath where Marxism is sort of anti-romantic in a sense, where it's like all these Marx said, religion is an opiate for the masses. Like all these stories you tell us about morality, I don't care about your fucking morality. You're the rich people. I'm the poor people. You have more money than me. You're exploiting me. I'm going to get your money. It's very like realist in a way. In another way, it's very romantic. But the underlying thing is actually this idea of like there's no one truth anymore. So everything's up for grabs.
Right.
We still haven't emerged from that. Modernism was based on the idea that we don't need religion to give us meaning. We have science. But we're in this postmodern place where we're realizing, well, science can't answer all questions. And actually the most important questions it can't answer, but we don't actually have a way of agreeing on how to answer those most important questions because we threw out religion. So now what? And so we're still living in this moment of the death of God. And, to do proper like civilization scale analysis, you have to be able to think in terms of not just decades, but centuries and even millennia. And you can think of it like cutting a movie, right? Like there's this phrase that has been used in both. The Marxists will say that the only revolution that matters is the last revolution. But there's in Christianity, there's this idea too that meaning is deferred. Like all this horror and suffering might occur, but then in the end, there's redemption. In the end, there's heaven. So you have to wait until the movie is over to judge any given scene in the movie. But when you're talking about history, where you slice it, really changes the story. If you slice the movie, if you say the movie ends in the year 1890, then the movie ends in a really high note. It's like there's been almost 100 years of peace following the Napoleonic Wars. Europe is in this period of incredible prosperity. There's been a triumph of certain values, certain ideas. It's this incredible period of time. If you end the movie in 1916, in the middle of World War I, this is incredibly depressing period where it's like all that actually like fell apart. And we actually just, massacred so many people in all these meaningless battles in this meaningless war, World War I. If you end the movie in 1927 and you're on the other side of it, everything seems great again. So like, where do you end the movie? And so from this point in time, the movie has a certain meaning. I think that it's really the ultimate move that I don't feel like I have the strength for anymore is to say like, whatever meaning you think 2021 has, if you're a pundit on CNBC or you're some influencer and you're like telling everyone like this is the story of the day, that's not the real story that matters. The real story that matters is the story we're going to tell in 2030 or 2050 or 3000, and it's playing for the meaning that will make sense in the future. Now, I don't have the confidence to predict that future, but people historically have, history judges them, if not favorably, at least as being influential. Did any of that make sense?
Oh, I'm with you every step of the way, brother. Every step of the way. It is such an experience chatting with you because, God, where are the Francises of the world? Because these are extremely challenging thoughts, questions, and ideas to grapple with. So to just even have the opportunity to get all of that context and different ways of looking at these really, really pivotal questions. I don't know. I feel super grateful. So just a moment of gratitude.
Thanks,
so
brother.
Thank you. One of the things you're talking about within there's an assumption of civilizational collapse. Now, one could argue that all civilizations and all things ultimately collapse. So the question really comes down to, you talked about a very important piece during that, um, where you talked about your personal impact, and that the
Mhm.
reason you spent 4 years sharing provocative, interesting, insightful things in order to create conversation, in order to illuminate truths, in order to just even give objective truth the possibility of a platform and a place to be discussed. You did all of that because you felt that there's a place in the story that is still yet to be written, right? I think many of us feel that. The reason I do what I do at times is because I feel that it's worth it in some sense, because the story is in the process of being written, that we each individually play a part in that. And that ultimately all change begins from an individual level. There's no sense in me or you going into politics and picking up a microphone and trying to scream at people, change, change, change. Here's a different way to think. It
Mhm.
begins with a blog post. It begins with this conversation. And yet, it sounds like where you landed is that it ultimately, in hindsight, perhaps wasn't worth it. And I'm curious if you mean that on an individual level, like for your own sense of peace and sanity, or not worth it in the sense that the story of this American civilizational collapse is, in a sense, written. The writing is on the wall. People are building their castles. It's all happening just as it did to Rome. Where are you personally with that? Is that, am I capturing that properly?
Yeah, you are capturing it properly. Hmm. I'm gonna
It's
look up
like,
a quote for you.
is it
So
worth it?
I here
Because we
there's
texted
so the
about
thing is,
this.
yeah, we did. There. So I think we're living in a plurivalent world, and what I mean by that is there's more than one narrative that makes sense to me that I could choose to invest with meaning as the most important narrative, the most likely, most possible and desirable future, the best, the most adaptive way of interpreting events. Um, there's more, in other words, there are many competing truths, and it's not actually clear to me which truth or which combination of truths is the right one, and what the right action should be. I'm going to read a quote from the Tao Te Ching. This is from Lao Tzu, 150 BC China. It's my favorite book. I've read it like 10 times. It's the Stephen Mitchell translation. It's teaching 29. You can read this whole book in one sitting. It's 81 pages. It's incredible. Do you want to improve the world? I don't think it can be done. The world is sacred. It can't be improved. If you tamper with it, you'll ruin it. If you treat it like an object, you'll lose it. There's a time for being ahead, a time for being behind, a time for being in motion, a time for being at rest, a time for being vigorous, a time for being exhausted, a time for being safe, a time for being in danger. The master sees things as they are without trying to control them. She lets them go their own way and resides in the center of the circle. There's another line in the Tao that says, what is a fool but a wise man's teacher? There's different translations that say, what is a fool but a wise man's job? What is a fool but a wise man's treasure? There's different ways of interpreting it, but the point, the thing is, there's before trying to change the world, it's good to try to understand it. And then when you really try to understand it, you should actually fail. There's this great Charlie Munger quote that, like, if you're not confused, you're not thinking hard enough, or something like that. Or maybe he says it even more bluntly, like, if you're not confused, you're stupid, or something like that. He says something very like, blunt like that. I think in the classical model, clarity and confusion are opposites. You become more clear and you become less confused. You become more confused, you become less clear. Increasingly, the world for me is the opposite. I become more clear as I become more confused. So,
Me too.
And
Going
so
through that as well, for sure.
Yeah. And so there's this line in Nietzsche: understanding kills action. Action depends on the veil of illusion. So you actually have to like, when you, this is kind of what the Tao is getting at here. Like when you really understand all the things that are going on in the world, you realize like A, you don't understand it. B, even if you do understand it, like it's so much vaster and more complex than you. And then C, if you actually sort of cease to be able to generate a better world, which is like, spiritually, everyone who wants to change the world is sort of like yelling at God. It's saying like, God, if you'd made the right world, it would be different. Like if I was God, I would make it this way. And then they like try to do it, right? But then you actually get to this point where you realize, well, here's an example. Somebody grows up, in poverty, and then spends their whole life being wealthy so that they can give their kids the opportunities they didn't have. And then their kids are spoiled and end up being the sort of people that they grew up resenting. And then they squander the wealth. And the next generation, those kids are raised in poverty and they become wealthy. Right. And you're like, well, when you really understand a cycle like that, what's the solution? It's not actually clear that a solution exists. The idea, there's a certain, you see this in the difference between Western and Eastern music. Like Western music definitely builds towards a climax. It looks like a hockey stick, right? Everything is up and to the right. It's very sort of masculine and orgasmic in that way. And the idea is that there's some sort of end of history where all the problems are solved. All the problems are solved. Like, so, okay, we want to solve climate change. Great. Okay, we want to solve North Korea. Great. What happens then? And then it's like, do we really think that like we've actually made progress? Is progress actually possible? Like, there's probably going to be some like other supervillain out there that's going to be creating chaos, and like there's probably going to be some other like cosmic challenge. And if there wasn't cosmic challenges, there weren't problems in the world, then we would have no opportunity for heroism. If there weren't villains, there wouldn't be heroes. If there weren't heroes, would the world be worth living in? Like, would we just be the people in WALL-E, sitting on spaceships drinking milkshakes and like fatting out of shape because there's nothing to do? There's the drama in the story is like the problem in the story. The drama is driven by the problem. Without the problem, it's just a bad story. That's kind of a ways. And I think that's kind of what Lao Tzu is getting at. It's like, don't be so eager to just fix it all. That being said, I think that there's,
go ahead.
I think that there are optimistic ways of looking at the world today. One of them is, the fact that I think we're seeing how brilliant I'm seeing how brilliant the federalist model is, right? Because you end up with all this experimentation, and ultimately it creates resilience. There's a form of like structural resilience in it. If the people in Washington get it wrong, maybe the people in Florida get it right. Maybe the people in Austin get it right. So there's this, and if the people in Washington and the people in Austin get it wrong, well, maybe some entrepreneur gets it right, or maybe a bunch of people, get it right in their own little homes. And like, maybe if the grid fails, somebody has a generator. There's all these like backup plans on backup plans. But what causes that redundancy is distrust. So maybe the distrust and disagreement is good, because if everyone trusted, we'd have one central point of failure. You know, that's a an argument in favor or sort of an optimistic way of looking at the world, that ultimately we'll get through this. I do think that I end up getting to this point where my brain fries on the macro, because I keep thinking about the so what for me, and I keep kind of drawing a blank. So even if I could like come up with some theoretical ideas for making the world a better place, it's unclear how I like do something about it.
You're not denying the impact or network effect of an individual person's actions, though, are you? You're just saying, I don't know how that plays out in the grand scheme of things towards some noble aim of what is best for the world, because what is best for the world, increasingly as I learn about it, becomes more and more confusing. And ultimately, I land in a place where it's not necessary. What is Mr. Lau really saying here? Because I'll tell you where I'm at with something.
Yeah, please tell me where you're at.
I am increasingly relinquishing this need for an external aim or purpose in life. And yet, I understand the value of, you know, as Jordan Peterson famously talks about, taking on the burden, grabbing something, a level of responsibility, defining a North Star and an aim, something worth living for in order to get through, as he looks at it in a slightly dark way, I think, this existence of suffering becomes more worth it when an individual has something to aim for and makes progress toward it. And that progress can create a feeling of fulfillment and happiness. And yet, for me, I am relinquishing that more and more, because I have found that often the aim is what is creating the suffering for me. The roller coaster that one sort of jumps on from the beginning to the end of their lives is what creates most of the suffering, because there is attachment to the way things should be. Well, that's my aim, and this is how it should be. And Francis, over the last year, I've suffered less, and I was suffering a lot because I had a timeline. I had a sort of vision of the conversations, the places, the wins, the accomplishments, all external. And I just got to a point where I said, this is fucking exhausting. And I feel like I'm driving myself crazy, and I'm making myself unhappy. And this is not what life is ultimately about. Perhaps the achievement-oriented junkie inside of me needs to chill out and take a look at the present moment and what's going on inside. And I'm oversimplifying this whole process of what I went through, and what it might look like for somebody else. But where I ultimately landed was, I think that there's still a requirement for some level of aim. What I struggle with is, does it mean anything? Is it like the realist who just goes, well, the purpose of my life, then I'll just make it up and it'll be this. And it's an external aim, and that's the purpose of their life. And they have to have one, because if they didn't have one, you kind of turn into a hippie or a beach bum, and you just become very hedonistic, right? And I can understand why people live that way, because they ultimately land in that position. So I think that the aim is important because it gives direction and movement, and something that potentially, I think, has a network effect and an impact on society that ultimately guides it to a brighter future. But the most important part being, what is it that I would do if money were no object? What is it that I can devote myself to that puts me into a state of flow, that makes me lose sense of time, that gives me joy, that allows me to sharpen my axe and develop a craft for myself? What gives me moments of bliss and awe and joy with others, through relationship, which is all I'll ultimately have in the end anyway, in these memories? And that is the direction that I'm increasingly taking my life, where I realized that all of the achievements that I am aiming for are a byproduct of being in that space. By letting go of all of those things that I cannot control, the irony is that they eventually do show up. Perhaps they don't look the same way. Perhaps they have taken on a new form, but often they're better than I ever even imagined. But only when I let them go and I live in the present. And that's where I've landed lately. It feels better, but I do wonder if the aim is just, is it worth it? Is it more just to have the North Star and that's it, and it creates a sense of direction, or is there truly a meaning here for all of us?
Yeah. So I think the teleological approach, we have a goal, and sort of the most macro level is like, let's imagine the most possible, the most desirable possible utopia. Like, let's imagine a place where we might be able to actually achieve it. It's not completely unrealistic, but it is really motivating, and let's all get there. And then, you list out all the problems you would want to solve, and there's probably like some solution that you can imagine to each problem. And then, you work yourself sort of working backwards all the way to the present. And so that's one way of sort of thinking about how to orient your life. Another is less teleological, more of an ethos or a way, and which is maybe I was driven by this most of my life, and I still am to some degree. It's the idea of expressing human potential, expressing my own potential, empowering other people to express their potential in the sort of Renaissance polymathic, polyanimate way, where it's like, you have physical potential. All of us have some sort of athletic potential. We have hands. We can use our hands to build things. We have a mind. We can use our mind to create things, whether that's music or art or companies or whatever. Let's see what we're made of, and let's use technology to make even more of it. Right? So that's maybe a different way. But I like where you ended up, which is the abandoning of all models. and there's this, I discovered the pre-Socratics this year, and you can read all of Heraclitus's 130 fragments in one sitting, and you can read pretty much all the other pre-Socratics in another few sittings, because there's just not much. Most of those scrolls were destroyed and very few of those fragments survived. But Heraclitus has a fragment that goes like this. Time is a game played beautifully by children. Eternity is children building sandcastles on the seashore. The kingship belongs to the children. And in the first blush of wisdom and age and experience and maturity, we're very focused on becoming the old wise man or the old wise woman, right? That has all the answers to the questions and is a fully functional adult and even beyond, right? But the problem with that, with age, is you get to the Nietzschean thing of understanding kills action. Action depends on the veil of evolution. The old person doesn't even start most things because he knows that they end in a futile place. Like, you're eventually going to die. And so it's sort of a beginner's luck, sort of the blessings of naivete and innocence and ignorance. So You have to kind of build a castle on the seashore because the waves are going to destroy it. But we're all in kind of a, it is kind of ridiculous that I'm living in New York City where everyone enters the subway and everyone bikes around on City Bike and everyone gets all sweaty and everyone goes to parties and we have like an almost unlimited appetite for bourgeois dining experiences. And so what, so we can go on another date, so we can close another deal, so we can, it's sort of like we are constantly like chasing the shiny object, and we put the apple in our mouth, and maybe it satisfies us for a moment, but eventually it turns to dust, but yet we want the next apple. And that is a childlike thing. There's a certain sense with which this is, what Lao Tzu was getting at with like, the fool is the wise man's teacher, like the wise man isn't running around like crazy in New York City. He's maybe at the top of the mountain meditating, doing nothing. The world would end if we were all wise. Maybe we need to be like foolish children, going moment to moment. I think the more paradoxes you see in the world, the more paralyzed you can become. But that doesn't actually mean that the solution is to stop seeing paradoxes or stop thinking about them. But the right action tends to emerge after you've like really weighed many conflicting truths, and then one emerges. And you sort of, it's almost precognitive. Like you feel it's right. You maybe can't articulate why. But that's more childlike, because you're in a place where you're like, the reasons are sort of, you've already forgotten about them at this point. You're just suddenly at the end of the day, you're doing something. And that's, you have to, not doing something is doing something. So everyone has to everyone's in a bind where we ultimately have to play out the story of our lives.
So your personal philosophy has evolved quite a bit, it sounds like. Not even just your personal philosophy, but the way in which you are taking action, or perhaps the ways in which you've withdrawn from taking action in certain areas. How do you feel now in hindsight?
Move. I find it so amusing that it's a casual question that we ask each other. How are you feeling? It's like such a complicated question. How are you doing? Yeah, I feel many things at once. Like most days, I feel completely broken on the inside and shattered and heartbroken and sad and depressed for all kinds of reasons, and frustrated and stuck and angry, and I feel all those. And so those certainly aren't the emotions or thoughts of a wise person or an enlightened person, right? But then on the other hand, I feel other things. I feel more gratitude I've ever felt in a long time. I also feel more empowered than I've ever felt in a long time. I also feel like I'm learning more than I have ever have, and so I see truths about most topics, whether it's political topics or business decisions or whatever, that are conflicting truths. Sometimes not just two truths, but sometimes four truths or five truths. Like, which one? What do I do? And in those moments, I can actually feel overwhelmed. But then suddenly the child takes over, and the child just, pulls a rabbit out of the hat, picks one of them. Like, I don't know. And I sort of, I've gotten to this point where Francis agonizes about a decision, then he makes a decision, and then he agonizes about another decision, makes a decision. But eventually you've made so many decisions that you become an algorithm, and you're dancing, and the world is dancing back, and you don't actually understand what's happening, and you almost have like a third person out of body view of the situation, where you observe yourself making decisions, but you really don't fully understand yourself. I don't even understand how a flush toilet works. I don't understand how my iPhone works. I am sure that Jeff Bezos does not understand how Amazon works. I don't understand how Invisible works. To quote T.S. Eliot, humility is endless. So you get to this place where you're like, whoa, there's a big giant dance going on. And the pre-Socratics, you get to the top of the mountain and you find a bunch of pre-Socratics there. The pre-Socratics are already there. Like Parmenides' basic belief was that no more than one thing exists. Everything is just one thing and it's all in flux. The past, the future, the present, it's all one thing. Motion doesn't exist. Individuals don't exist. It's all just this one dancing fluid thing that you have the illusion that you are Francis or that you are Arman and that you have the illusion that you're making decisions. But when you get to this point where the words fall away and all that's left is the dancing, to quote T.S. Eliot, for the pattern is new in every moment, and every moment is a new and shocking valuation of all we have been. And then he has stillness, the dancing. So the darkness shall be the light, and the stillness, the dancing. I love that. When you get to this place of poetry where, you move through words, beyond words, to this place of just like, whoa, what is going on? It is so far beyond me. It's beyond any of us. I am so confused. I'm so clear. That's
love it. So we've talked a lot of macro level topics here to bring it kind of home and to think about things on maybe a more micro level, more personal level, or just things you've been observing lately. I'm curious, what is something that you've been generally excited about lately, whether it be something that you're optimistic about that's happening in the world or happening in your world, in your market, or it's just something you've been really researching, studying, that you're sort of just fascinated by lately?
Yeah, so Invisible's going through an incredible period of success. Like we tripled revenues last year, we have burn. This year, we're on track to like 4 or 5x revenues. We're profitable as of this month. And
congratulations.
All the hires we plan. Thank you. All the hires we plan on doing for the next all the hires we plan on doing for the next 18 months, we should be able to finance internally with profits and still throw off capital and use that to reinvest in the business and use that to align incentives. There's a human element in all of this. Like we now have 500 agents, and by the end of the year we'll have close to 800, and next year we'll have 1,500 or more.
Wow.
And there are more people working at the company than I could ever really meet and get to know.
Right.
There are all these human stories going on that are just, I am excited about them. I'm grateful for them. But there is this feeling of like, this quarter happened years ago. I think that's a Jeff Bezosism. So the things I'm actually excited about, they're not real yet. They're farther in the future. On the business front, I am excited about the next chapter of the company, and what to do with the increasing influence that scale provides.
And in a company like yours, I think that will be extremely open-ended in terms of where you could take it, because and can you give like the little 1 or 2 sentence elevator pitch of what Invisible does? Because I don't think everybody knows and may not have listened to your first episode.
Right. Yeah, Invisible is ops as a service. So we make it very easy to delegate any business process, any instruction-based, repetitive digital workflow. So something you or your team or your company, is doing in front of a computer screen, and you can't fully automate it internally. So you're either going to have to hire an internal operations team, or you're going to have to outsource it. Invisible combines outsourcing and automation in one end-to-end solution. So we make it really easy to delegate these custom, complex processes. And we've built a digital assembly line that coordinates 500 workers in 30 countries around the world. They log in securely through Amazon workspaces. Our software assigns steps to them, which depending on who's online and who has the right skills. And those are the steps that we haven't fully automated yet. But our process builder basically takes our clients' custom processes and turns them into standard steps like Legos that we can optimize and automate. And we use like 200 different third-party automation tools. We build our own automation tools, and our business model aligns incentives. So as we get more efficient at running your process, our margins improve and your price drops. Let's just say, for example, you're an insurance company and you come to us and you say, Invisible, can you run claims processing for us? And we run your claims process and it works out to $10 per claim. Well, over time, our incentive is to automate it and get more efficient and eventually bring down the price to $5 a claim so our margins can improve. Mm-hmm. And so we support, a wide, almost like unlimited use cases, depending on what industry or what function. So we'll help sales teams with lead generation. We'll help data operations teams tag data. We'll help food delivery companies digitize restaurant menus so that when you open your food delivery app, you have all the right menu data in the app and you can actually order your burrito. We'll help logistics companies with dispatching. We'll help real estate companies identify homes for them to buy based on, scraping the internet. So there's all kinds of different use cases, but the underlying thing is you don't have to use, there's an app for everything. So why isn't everything perfect yet? And the answer is that you don't have time to use all these tools. So Invisible can just run your processes for you and make them more efficient over time so that you have more time back. You have more time, more money to focus on your most productive activities, being really strategic, being really creative, et cetera.
Your website is at what URL?
INV, like invisible, INV.tech. Invisible Technologies is the name of the company.
Nice and easy. Nice and easy. And it's inherently deflationary. And the Kathy Woods of the world would be very excited and proud to know that you're playing a big part in that. And again, I mean, back to the North Star, I think that that's a beautiful one. I think that that's, from the work perspective, an incredible thing to do for the world. And you could be the first of many digital assembly lines that shape our future. And that's something to be extremely proud of. And I think the real thing to be proud of is building a business where the fundamentals are actually healthy and in place. Yeah. And it's not just a no revenue pipe dream that the bull market is investing in. It's one in which you are producing in a profitable way. And so congratulations, seriously, because that's not something you can say every day to a founder. It takes years, years and years and years.
Yes. And it has taken years. Henry Ford created this deflationary miracle turn of the 20th century where his cars were getting cheaper and cheaper every year, and they were becoming higher and higher quality. And his workers were getting paid more every year, and his revenues were increasing and his margins were increasing. So it was a win-win-win-win. Like everyone was benefiting more every year. And that, those things are normally in trade-off relationships. So how did he do it? And the transcendence was through, industrializing the process. And so we're industrializing knowledge work in a similar way. Pure outsourcing is suboptimal. Pure software is suboptimal. But this combined approach where we can provide an end-to-end solution for clients is allowing us to create similar, better, faster, cheaper, better, faster, cheaper, better, faster, cheaper outcomes.
You've obviously really studied that very clearly, and you're emulating it in this decade now. I know you said to me recently you're pretty much off social media, but is there any way people can
Mhm.
reach you if they want to?
I am still findable on LinkedIn.
Nice.
Send me a message so I know you're not a spammer and you found me through the
Oh, my
podcast. And
LinkedIn is pure spam. No, I'll find you and I'll include, yep,
great.
you are. I'll include the link for people. And yeah, please
Yeah,
do keep in touch with Francis. Francis is one of the longest episodes I've done in a while now, but I had a feeling it would be. It's so easy to talk to you. You're an
you
amazing
too.
human being. Thank you for spending
Thanks for
time with
humoring
me.
me.
Yeah, it's
Thank you.
far beyond that. You're incredibly important. And yeah, I really love and appreciate the friendship, man. I hope we do many, many more of these over the years.
Grateful for you. Thank you for being interested in such abstract topics. Most people, are just focused on what's immediately in front of them.
Mhm.
But this is this is a unique conversation for me too. There's not very many people I can have this with.
Yeah, I can't help it. Thanks, man.